Thank you. All right, so hello everyone and welcome to the pool party you will never forget. And today I will show you how I managed to take over an unexplored Windows component and uncover brand new and fully undetectable process injection techniques. So my name is Alon, as mentioned, and I'm a security researcher at SafeBreach. I'm 21 years old and mainly self-taught. My main interest and focus include operating system internals, reverse engineering, and vulnerability research. And also, before joining the security field, I was a professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete where I won several world and European titles. So this is what we'll be talking about today. First up, we'll start with some research background and motivation, followed by the research goals. Next, I'll take you behind the scenes of the research process. We'll deep dive into the internals of the Windows usable thread pool, followed by an introduction to the pool party tool. And I'll sum up with research implications and takeaways. So, for those of you who don't know, process injection is an evasion technique used to execute arbitrary code in a target process. It usually consists of a chain of 3 primitives. The first one would be the allocation primitive, used to allocate memory on the target process. The second one would be a writing primitive, used to write shellcode to the allocated memory, and then the third primitive would be an execution primitive, used to execute the malicious code written. The primitives on their most basic forms would be the virtual alloc-ex Windows API for allocation, the write process memory API for writing, and then the creator mode thread API for execution. And these basic primitives composed together form a very known injection technique called creator mode thread. And this injection technique is very simple yet powerful, but there is only one downside to it. It is detectable by all modern EDRs. And this research aimed to discover new process injection techniques that are fully undetectable. Now, we all know the risk of process injections. It can probably lead to serious evasive attacks, making malicious actions become completely legitimate. Using process injections, we can probably perform meaningful attacks, such as credential dumping or even running a ransomware while staying undetected. And this is exactly what I managed to do, and I promise you that I'll show you how. The motivation for this research was derived from the fact that process injection techniques abuse legitimate features of the operating system. And so I wondered, can an EDR effectively distinguish legitimate versus malicious use of a feature? And I also wondered, is the current detection approach generic enough to detect new and never before seen process injections? To answer these questions, I've had to review the current detection approach employed by EDRs against process injections. And so experimenting with the different primitives led me to the conclusions that EDR based their detection mainly on the execution primitive. On top of that, write and allocate primitives in their most basic forms are not detected. And as I mentioned in the motivation for this research, I wanted to understand how EDRs distinguish legitimate and malicious use of a feature. So taking thread creation as an example, EDRs would not usually allow a thread to be created for processes other than the current process. Another example for a similar approach by EDRs would be detecting the asynchronous procedure call injection. And I noticed that EDRs would not usually allow an APC to be queued to a thread belonging to processes other than the current process. So very similar to the thread creation detection. In summary, write and allocate primitives in their most basic forms are not detected. The detection is based on execution primitives, and the execution primitives are detected based on comparing the initiator versus the creator of an action. With better understanding of the detection approach, I could define the research goals. And my ultimate goal was to find new process injection techniques that are fully undetectable, and I wanted it to be applicable against all Windows processes, no prerequisites whatsoever. Based on the detection approach lessons learned, we know that writing and allocation primitives are not detected. So what if we created an execution primitive which is based only on allocation and writing primitives? Furthermore, what if the execution is triggered by a legitimate action? What if I told you that writing to an innocent file on the file system could trigger a malicious shellcode in a target process? While searching for a suitable component that will help me in achieving my research goals, I came across the Windows UseMod thread pool. And before I explain why the thread pool ended up being the perfect target, you may wonder what even is a thread pool, right? So to explain what is a thread pool, I'll use a simple metaphor. Imagine that you have a pile of boxes that needs to be mailed, and mailing each box individually can take a lot of time and effort. But what if you could send boxes in parallel? So to speed things up, you decide to create a team of deliverymans, and the team of deliverymans are responsible for taking boxes from the pile of boxes and deliver them. In the world of computers, this parallelism is what we call a thread pool. And so the thread pool's pile of boxes is called a work queue, and each box in the pile of boxes is called a work item. And then the thread pool deliverymans are responsible for, they are called worker threads, and the goal of those worker threads is to dequeue work items from the work queue and execute it. And here it is important to do the separation between worker threads and work items, right? Because the worker threads are the ones executing the work items, which reside in the queue. So now that we understand what a thread pool is, let me tell you why I choose the thread pool as my target. First of all processes on Windows have a thread pool by default, which ensures that if I find new injection techniques, they will be applicable against all Windows processes. In addition, work items and thread pools are represented by structures, which increases the possibility of having an execution primitive based only on allocation and writing primitives. And on top of that, we have multiple work item types that are supported by the Windows UseMod thread pool, which means that we have more opportunities. So with that in mind, let's take a swim in the thread pool, starting from its architecture. The thread pool comprises 3 distinct work queues, and each one is dedicated to a different type of work item. You can see the queues on the left side of the diagram. The queues include a task queue, a timer queue, and an IO completion queue residing in the kernel. The worker threads on the right side of the diagram are operating on the different queues to dequeue work items and execute them. So we have the worker threads on one side, the queues on the other side, and the worker threads are just dequeuing and executing. Lastly, in Windows, the thread pool contains a worker factory object, and this worker factory object is responsible for managing the worker threads. And do not bother with memorizing each part of this architecture, as we will cover the relevant parts later. In regards of attack surface, though, we have the 3 different work queues, and we know that an insertion of a valid work item into one of these queues will result in the work item to execute. And other than the queues, we have the worker factory that serves as the worker threads manager, which may be used to take over the worker threads. And just before we move on to exploring each component in the attack surface, I would like to introduce you to the pool party. The pool party is an exclusive party that I will use to gather all the injection techniques that I find. You can see that the pool is now empty, but do not be intimidated by the emptiness of the pool, as I promise you that I'll do my best to recruit new friends to the party as we move along. So let's start from attacking the worker threads manager, so-called the worker factory. A worker factory is a Windows object which is responsible for managing thread pool worker threads. And if we use the deliveryman's metaphor that we used before, the worker factory is the same as the deliveryman manager. So in case a deliveryman did not send any box for like an hour, the manager would probably send him home. So very similarly, the worker factory manages the worker threads by monitoring active or blocking worker threads, and based on the monitoring results, it would create or terminate worker threads. So if a worker thread did not process any work item for a long time, or if we have worker threads that are busy, then the worker factory would create new worker threads. It is important to note that the worker factory does not perform any scheduling or execution of actual work items. Again, the separation here between the worker threads and the work items. The only goal of the worker thread is to make sure that the number of the worker factory is to make sure that the number of worker threads is sufficient. Now, the kernel exposes multiple system calls to interact with the worker factory objects. Among them, we have the creation and shutdown system calls to create or shut down a worker factory. We also have the query and set system calls, which are basically just a getter or setter for the kernel object. And then we have the ready, wait, and release system calls. On the monitor, you can see the definition of the worker factory creation system call. With the goal of taking over worker threads, the relevant target would be the start routine. This routine is the entry point of the worker threads, and usually it serves as a threadful scheduler responsible for the dequeuing and execution of work items. And this routine can be controlled in the worker factory creation system call, and more interestingly, the system call accepts a handle to the process of which to create the worker factory for. So at first look, it sounds really promising. Can we just create a worker factory for another process and have its start routine point to a malicious shellcode? The answer is no, we cannot. Trying to create a worker factory for another process would fail due to an incorrect parameter. And looking at the implementation of the system call in the kernel, I noticed that there is a validation that makes sure no worker factories are created for processes other than the current process. And yes, generally speaking, it is odd that the system call gets a parameter with only one possible value, but let's move on for now to explore other alternatives that could lead to abusing the start routine. So going back to one of the main reasons that we choose the thread pool as our target was since all Windows processes have a thread pool by default, and consequentially a worker factory object by default. So instead of going to the trouble of creating a malicious worker factory for a more process, we can simply utilize the duplicate handle API to gain access to an already existing worker factory that the target process has. And this duplicate handle API is very simple. It accepts a target process handle and an handle value, and then it duplicates the handle from the target process to the current process. So given access, using the duplicate handle API, we can gain access to the worker factory, but given access does not let us control the start routine pointer because this pointer is constant and it cannot be naturally changed after the object was initialized. With that said, if we can determine the start routine value, we can overwrite the routine code with the malicious shellcode. So in this case, you can see that we have the worker factory object and it contains a start routine of 0x.beef. And this value cannot be changed to an arbitrary value, but what can be changed is what 0x.beef points to. And this is exactly our goal. So we need to find the target process's start routine value, and the query system call can help with that, right? Because it gets us information about the worker factory. It accepts a worker factory handle, an information class stating which information to query, and then an output buffer that the retrieved information will be written to. The only supported information class to query using the query system call is an information class retrieving basic information on the worker factory. And in our case, it is enough because the basic information includes the start routine pointer that we are targeting. And given the start routine pointer, we can now overwrite the contents of it with a malicious shellcode. And this routine is guaranteed to run at some point, but it would be even better if we could also trigger its execution instead of just waiting for it. So the ideal spot to examine would be the set system call, allowing us to modify worker factory attributes. And this system call is very similar to the query one. The only difference is that this time the buffer is an input buffer and not an output buffer. Now this system call supports a little more information classes than the query system call. And the one that suits our needs the best is the worker factory thread minimum information class. And it basically sets the minimum running worker threads number of the worker factory. And why it is useful. So consider that we have a worker factory object with 2 worker threads currently running. You can also see that the minimum threads number in the object illustration is 2. If we set the minimum worker threads number to be the current running threads number plus 1, so in this case, if we set it to 3 instead of 2, it will result in a new worker thread to be created, meaning that the start routine will get executed. So with that, let me show you the first brand new and fully undetectable process injection technique of the day. We would start by making sure, by getting the handle table of the target process, and we do it by using the NDQuery information process system call. Once we have the handle table, we iterate over it, and we duplicate the worker factory handle once we find it. And given access to the worker factory of the target process, we query basic information from it, and we do it in order to obtain the start routine value. So this step essentially gets us the address of the start routine that you can see on the victim process. Using the information obtained, we write shellcode to the start routine of the worker factory. And lastly, we set the minimum worker threads number to trigger the malformed start routine. So we now have our first friend in the pool party, but we do not want to leave this friend all alone in the pool, so let's move on to explore the thread pool queues, because maybe we can recruit new friends to the party. So when attacking the thread pool, my main goal was to insert a work item to a target process. And so my focus was on how work items are inserted into the thread pool. I knew that the correctly inserted work item will get executed by the worker thread at one point or another. I also assumed that I have access to the thread pool's worker factory object of the target process, because in the latest variant, we just proved that such access can be granted by duplicating the worker factory handle. The thread pool supports multiple work items, and they could be divided into three types. We have the regular work items, which are queued right away by the queuing API call, right? So we call the queuing API call, the work item is queued right away. We have the asynchronous work items, which are queued on operation completion. So for example, when a write file operation was completed, or when you read from a file, but any operation completion. And we have the timer work items, which are queued right away by the queuing API call, but they are executed asynchronously once the timer is expired. So the timer work items kind of combination of both the regular work items in terms of queuing, and then the asynchronous work items in terms of execution. And as for the three types of work items, we also have three queues, as we mentioned in the architecture. So the regular work items are queued to the task queue residing in the main thread pool structure. The asynchronous work items are queued to the IO completion queue, which is actually a Windows object. And the timer work items are queued to the timer queue, also residing in the main thread pool structure. So we have two queues residing in a thread pool structure in the target process's address space. So we expect that abusing this structure would involve using writing primitives to manipulate the structures in runtime. And then we have the completion queue, which is a Windows object. So we expect that abusing this object would involve using the exposed system calls. Before we dive into the queuing mechanism of each work item type, it is important to note that work item callbacks would not be executed directly by the worker threads. Instead, each work item has a helper callback that is used to execute the work item callback. And the structures that is queued is the helper structure. So we have the work item structure in the blue color, and we have the green structure, which is the helper one. What gets queued is not the blue structure, but the green structure. So just keep it in mind, because it will really help us to better understand the queuing mechanism of the work items. So let's start with the regular work item, the TP work. And by looking closely at the work item structure, I found its helper part called the task structure. So now we know that the task structure, which is the helper, is what gets put in the task queue within the target, within the thread pool structure. But here is the real question: how does it get there? How does the task get queued? So in order to understand it, I've had to reverse engineer the queuing API, and the API responsible for queuing is the TP post task API. We can see that it uses insert tail list to insert a given task into a queue. So the thread pool task queue is a doubly linked list of tasks. You can see the doubly linked list containing currently 3 tasks. If we call the TP post task API on this queue, it will result in the task to be queued to the end of the queue. So we can see that we now have 4 tasks in the queue. And so given the thread pool structure of the target process, we can tamper with its task queue to inject a malicious task into it. And with that, let me show you the second, brand new and fully undetectable process injection technique of the day. Similar to the first variant, we start by getting the handle table of the target process. We then proceed by duplicating the worker factory handle. And then we query basic information from the worker factory. And this time, we do not need the start routine. We need the start parameter, which is a pointer to the main thread pool structure. This step basically gets the address of the TP pool task that you can see on the victim process. We then read the structure from the target process to the current process, and we do it in order to obtain the task queue, so we know where to insert a work item to. We then proceed by creating the malicious work item that is callback points to a shellcode. We then allocate memory for the malicious work item in the target process, and then we write the malicious work item to the target process. You can see that the work item and the task queue are not currently connected. So Lastly, we use any writing primitive to insert the malicious work item to the target task queue. And this step essentially manipulates the task queue in a way that it will have a new work item in its head. And as a result, the scheduler will dequeue the malicious work item and execute its callback. So please welcome in our second friend in the pool party. And I was pleased to have 2 friends in the pool party, but this is not a real party without at least 5 to 10 friends. So let's move on to attack asynchronous work items, and hopefully we can recruit them to the party as well. Asynchronous work items are associated with Windows objects, and they're executed asynchronously once an operation on the object was completed. And all of these work items are queued to the IO completion queue. So before we dive into how they're queued, let me first explain what the completion queue is. So the completion queue is basically a Windows object that serves as a queue for completed IO operations. Notifications are inserted into the queue once an IO operation completes. So we have an IO operation on one side and the queue on the other side. Once the IO operation completes, a notification that is defined in the operation is queued into the queue. And the thread pool kind of uses this mechanism, relies on this mechanism to receive notifications when an asynchronous work items operation is completed. So we can expect that from the scheduler side, what will happen is that it will basically dequeue the completed notifications from the queue and execute it. Now, please note, as a side note, that Microsoft refers to these objects, the IO completion queues, how I call them, IO completion ports. But these objects are basically just kernel queues, so for the sake of simplicity, I will refer to them as IO completion queues. The kernel exposes a few system calls to interact with the completion queues. We have the create system call to create a completion queue, an open system call to open one by its name, if it has a name. Then we have a query and set system calls, which are basically getter and setter, and then the remove system call, which is used to remove an entry from the queue. And really the most interesting system call between all of them is the set system call, because it can be used to queue notification to the IO completion queue. So keep this in mind, because we'll get back to the system call later on. Just keep in mind that we have the ability to queue a notification to a given queue. So equipped with some IO completion queues background, let's jump right into the queuing mechanism of the asynchronous work items. And I'll use the TPIO work item as an example, but note that the same concepts apply to the other work items as well. The TPIO work item is a work item that is intended to execute on completion of file operations such as read and write. So you would use this work item if you want to execute a callback when a read operation is completed or write operation was completed. And the helper structure of the TPIO work item is the TP-direct structure that you can see. So we expect this structure to be queued, right? Because the helper structures are what gets queued. The function responsible for associating the work items file with the completion queue is the TP-bind file to direct function. This function sets the completion queue of the thread pools, the file completion queue to be the thread pools completion queue, and then the completion key to be the direct structure. So it basically just does the setup. So let's have an illustration to see how it actually works. Consider that we have a file object without a defined queue and an empty key. You can see the file object illustration on the left. And consider that we also have an empty queue, which you can see on the right. Calling the bind file to direct function will result in the completion queue of the file object pointing to the thread pools one, and then the key pointing to the direct structure. And at that point, as I said, this is just a setup, and you will see that the queue is still empty, right? Because no operation on the file occurred yet. Any operation on the file following the function call, for example, write file, would cause the completion key to be queued to the queue as a notification. And as a result, the scheduler dequeues this notification and executes it. So to conclude, the asynchronous work items are queued to the completion queue, and the direct structure is what gets queued. Having the handle to the completion queue of the target process gives us the ability to queue notifications to it. And with that, let me show you the third brand new and fully undetectable process injection technique of the day. We start off as usual by getting the handle table of the target process. We proceed by duplicating the worker factory handle. And then we query basic information from the worker factory to get the start parameter value, which is a pointer to the main thread pool structure. This step essentially just gets us the TP pool that you can see on the victim process. We then read the structure from the target process to the current process. We do it in order to know which completion queue the target thread pool uses. And once we have this handle value, we duplicate the IO completion queue handle that the target thread pool uses. We then create an innocent file on the file system. And following the file creation, you create a malicious work item. We then allocate memory for the work item on the target process. And then we write the malicious work item to the target process. You will see that the work item and the queue are not currently connected. So to connect them, we use the anti-set information file system call. And we associate the innocent file that we have created with the thread pool's completion queue. And we also set the key to pointing to the malicious direct structure. Lastly, we write content to the innocent file that we have created, and it causes the malicious shellcode to get executed in the target process. And you could also read from the file, it doesn't really matter. And what's really interesting here is that a completely legitimate action writing to a file caused a malicious shellcode to get executed in a target process. So this capability is very cool. And now you may ask yourself, how do we also insert the other asynchronous work items, the LPC, job, and wait work items? So basically, any TP direct notification to the queue will get executed at one point or another. So it's really all a matter of how we queue the notification to the queue. We can achieve this notification queuing. One way of achieving the queuing would be by utilizing Windows objects. And in this case, it would be very similar to the TPIO abuse we just showed. It will involve associating the Windows object with the completion queue of the target process. And then any operation on this object, any operation completion will result in the work item to execute. So basically, by using this, you can also achieve the shellcode execution with other variety of legitimate actions, such as when an event is set, you can execute a shellcode. When assigning a process to a job object, you can execute a shellcode. And also when connecting to LPC ports, all very legitimate actions. Now we can also queue notifications directly without proxying it through any Windows object, and this will involve using the set IO completion system call that I have mentioned earlier. So really we don't have to proxy it through a Windows object. We can just queue it directly. So there is a trade-off here. So please welcome in 5 new friends to the pool party, and our new friends include the 4 asynchronous work items, the IO, LPC, job, and wait, and also the TP direct insertion inserted directly by this anti-set IO completion system call. Our pool party is almost complete, but we've got one final work item that hasn't joined the fun yet. We do not want to neglect the timer, so let's see if we can recruit one last friend to the party. And bear with me for this one, because this one is even cooler than the last variants. You would not want to miss the variant that is able to trigger after the attacker already vanished from the system. So first, when I was looking at the creation and submission API of the timer work item, I noticed a very interesting fact, and it is that no timer handle is applied to neither of them. We can see that the submission API set thread pool timer accepts some timer configuration such as due time and period, but where does the actual timer object reside? So it turns out that the timer work items operate on an existing timer object which resides in the timer queue, and it is not supplied by the caller. So the timer is kind of free used each time that the caller uses this API. What happens under the hood is that once the submission API is called, the work item is inserted into the queue, and the timer object residing in the queue is configured accordingly to the user supplied parameters. And once the timer is expired, a dequeuing function is called, which dequeues the work item and executes it. And generally speaking, timer objects in Windows do not natively support callback execution in expiration. But all you need to know about it is that the thread pool implements it by using the TP wait work item, which supports timers. So in Windows, they kind of implement a work item to dequeue other work items. So to conclude, if we set the timer queue to expire, the dequeuing function is called. So the main question here is how do we correctly queue a timer to the queue? So the connectors between a timer and the queue are the Windows end links and Windows start link fields. And for the sake of simplicity, you can think of these two fields as just list entries of doubly linked list. The function that queues the timer is that queues the timer to the queue is TPP enqueueTimer, and it basically just insert the start links, the start to the Windows start link fields, and the Windows end to the Windows end link fields. So let's have an illustration. We have a timer on one side and a timer queue on the other side. If we call this TPP enqueueTimer, it will just make the timer queue Windows start to have the start links and the Windows end to have the end links. So the work item submission API is responsible for two main actions. The first one is to queue the timer work item to the queue, and then the second one would be to configure the timer object residing in the queue. And combining these two actions together, once the timer object expires, it will execute the work item. So with that, let me show you the last brand new and fully undetectable process injection technique of the day. We start off as usual by getting the handle table of the target process. We then proceed by duplicating the worker factory handle. And then we get basic information of the worker factory. Once we have this basic information, we can read the target thread pool structure from the target process to the current process, and we do it in order to obtain the timer queue to know where exactly we need to insert our malicious work item. We then proceed by creating the malicious work item. We then allocate memory for it in the target process, and then we write the malicious work item to the target process. And here again, you can notice that the timer and the queue are not connected. So next, we use any writing primitive to insert the work item to the queue, residing in the main thread pool structure. Now that they are connected, all that is left to do is to trigger the dequeuing function. So we start off by duplicating the timer handle that the thread pool uses, so we can now set it to expire. And then we set the timer to expire by using the anti-set-timer system call. And you can set the timer to expire in 1 second, or in 1 minute, or in 10 hours. It doesn't really matter, because eventually, when the timer is expired, the malicious code activates. And what's even more crazy about this variation is that the attacker can, after it sets the timer, it can exit the process and erase its identity from the system. As a result, the system would appear clean from a forensic perspective, but when the timer runs out, the malicious code activates. So did you ever think that expiration of a timer would trigger a malicious shellcode in a target process? Me neither. And so please welcome in our last friend in the pool party. And with 8 friends in the party, let me introduce you to the pool party tool. So pool party supports 8 variants, from the start routine abuse to the insertion of any work item that the thread pool supports. And pool party effectively bypasses Palo Alto Cortex, Sentinel-1 EDR, CrowdStrike Falcon, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and Cybereason. And these vendors are leaders according to Gartner's Magic Quadrant. And pool party achieved 100% success rate, as none of the EDRs that I have tested was able to detect or prevent pool party attacks. Now, let me show you the first demo of pool party in action. We start by making sure that the EDR is up and running. We're using CrowdStrike in this time. We then locate the notepad, the target process PID, which is notepad, and we try to use a known injection technique, create remote thread, to inject code into it. You can see that it is detected by the EDR. So we proceed to use pool party to introduce pool party. You can see that all of the 8 variants are supported. So let's start by injecting code that will spawn a child process under notepad. You can see that once the injection is completed, the child process is popped. So let's continue to the second variant, the third variant, the fourth variant, and so on. You can see that Notepad is running as usual. And when we finish all of the injection techniques, notice 8 child processes under Notepad. You can see it now. And there's not even one detection being raised. Thank you.